So maybe a quick show of hands. How many people have heard of the Against Malaria Foundation? That's well, we got the last one, 100%.
Great.
So you all know they've been a GiveWell top charity for many years. Rob Mather is their founder and CEO, here to give his talk on the impact of accountability. You have Rob here. He has his slides, and I'm just going to let him take it away after we give him a welcome.
It's always good getting an applause before I've said anything. That means it's going to be terrific when I've said something. So what I'm going to try and do is whip through in about 20 minutes what we do and how we do it, which effectively is what the next 25 or so slides are about. So without further ado, but I should just say, I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. I spent 2 years living in Boston and I miss it. But unfortunately, I can't be with you today. So let's get stuck in. Many of you will know, if you know of AMF, that malaria is a big problem, and you can read this faster than I can say it. It's a humanitarian issue, it's an economic issue. There's no vaccine. And the most significant thing we can do to stop particularly children under 5 and pregnant women dying from malaria and falling sick is to make sure they're covered when they sleep at night with a $2 bed net. And because the pregnant female mosquito that carries malaria wants to bite between 10 o'clock at night and 2 a.m., that's one of the things we have on our side, hence the value of the nets, and they work particularly well. And if we went down to the end of, airport runway, went down to the end of Logan, and we watched this happen twice a day, it wouldn't take all of us very long to say, hang on a minute, we've got to do something about this. And that's really why I started AMF 14 years ago, because at the time it was 7 jumbo jets, or 7 747s, so we're making progress. But the number of passengers in those 2 planes, if they were all under 5s, times 4 would be the equivalent to how many children die today, tomorrow, the next day, I'm afraid, of malaria. So big problem and a pretty emotive one. But a big part of the solution, as I mentioned, is a long-lasting insecticidal net. They're covered with insecticides so that it's not just a mechanical barrier. And in the challenging environments in which they're distributed, they get ripped, they have holes. And fortunately, the mosquito doesn't do an aerobatics maneuver through a hole. It lands on the net, it picks up insecticide, and that causes knockdown, kills it. So these are incredibly effective at protecting people when they sleep at night, even when they're compromised with holes and rips and tears and so on. So they last for 3 years. They do a great job. And the impact we can quantify by saying there is a range, as you'd imagine. It depends on the malaria burden in a particular area. But roughly every 600 nets we install equates to 1 life saved and about 1,000 cases of malaria not happening. So, for a couple of dollars, it's an extraordinary, or for $1,200 for 600 nets. If you then add on the cost of distributing nets, I think the most recent number from GiveWell is about $3,000 a life or something like that. So we're talking a few $1,000s per life, which is, a very, very low number. So what we do at AMF is we provide nets, we distribute them, we make sure they don't get stolen. Really, really big issue for us, for everybody else if we don't focus on it, and we ensure they get used. There's no point in distributing the nets and for the next 3 years they don't get used. So we do a lot of post-distribution follow-up, as I'll mention in passing. And we get into discussions with national governments now and say, a lot more politely than I'm about to put it, but we say to them, please don't ask us to trust you, because we won't. But we won't ask you to trust us either. Let's just focus on the data, because when you're distributing millions of nets at a time, you've really got to understand where those nets are going, and you can't rely on anecdotal stories or glossy reports. We don't do any of that, so we focus on data. Just a few brief words about how AMF started. It actually started as a WSM, we used to call it, World Swim Against Malaria. And I invited a lot of people to swim. I won't give you the whole backstory in the time we've got available, but so we ended up with a 250,000 people swimming. And my request to everybody involved, Michael Phelps included, was, in fact, my words to Michael were to, I'd like you to say, it doesn't matter how quickly I swim in a swimming pool. If I swim, I count as one person. And if you swim, you count as one person too. So there was very much a sort of grassroots feel behind this, because when I found out that at the time, 7 jumbo jets full of under 5s die from malaria every day, my wife and I had 2 young children at the time, and I guess it resonated. And it came on the back of a swim for a small burns victim. And there's a bit of information on our website about that. But I approached 20 organizations and said, would you give me 5,000 people to swim? And they all said yes. And so that enabled me to launch World Swim Against Malaria with 100,000 people, and we eventually climbed to 250,000. And we had all sorts of people involved swimming. We had really nutty, wonderfully nutty people, top left, who were swimming in the Serpentine, a lake in the middle of London, in December. Boy, was it cold. People swimming in the English Channel between England and France. I don't think anybody swam the whole distance. And then the much more sensible people, top picture, I think, is in America, and the bottom picture is in Australia. All types of people involved in very many countries around the world. We had very many dots. That's just a starting map. It then filled up with many more dots. And wherever there's a dot, there was somebody swimming. So we had people on cruise liners. We had people in all sorts of islands off coasts. And what was really important to me is we had lots of children involved, because 70% of the deaths are children under 5. So, and of course, if you have children involved, you're effectively involving parents, the sisters, the uncles, the aunts. It's a bit like a pebble in a pond. So if you have one person involved, it ripples out, and you touch, you make aware of this thing called malaria, which I was struck by how little many people knew about malaria many years ago, and I can believe it now. Certainly less so now. So that's how we started. And I was shameless in calling a whole series of organizations and saying, please, will you help me, but I'm not going to pay you, because you don't need $5 more than a couple of children in Africa need a bed net. Again, I was a little bit more polite than that. But the organizations at the top were terrific in saying, we'll help you, and we won't charge you. And to this day, in a sense, I don't pay for anything when it comes to central costs. The only 4 costs I have are the salaries of the 4 people I employ. And that's it. We don't pay for anything else. No banking, no accounting, no legal, no technology, no translating, no nothing. Charity in 12 countries. We don't have any physical offices. It's all done sort of virtually. And where we need help, a company has stepped forward, or individuals have stepped forward and said, we'll help you. So it means that our central costs are unbelievably low. I don't think that necessarily makes us a great organization for that, but I will say that having only $300,000 a year of central costs when you're generating $50 million in revenue is really nice, and I don't have to go out and spend time finding money to fund $1 million worth of central costs. We leverage technology significantly. So, and I guess my background is sort of building things and designing things out. So we try and get to the point where we're really focused on the people we're trying to assist in Africa, particularly, or primarily, rather than spending lots of time on admin. So lots of technology we bring to bear. And we as an organization work with co-funding partners. So typically we fund the nets, other people fund the non-net costs, and that's shipping, pre-distribution work, distribution work. In other words, those costs in country. So I don't have to go through what is a very time-consuming and resource-consuming process of putting budgets together in country and checking actual costs when they come in, because we'll fund the $2 for the net and somebody else will fund the $1 to $1.50 for the non-net costs. And it's a really good partnership. And then we have ministries of health and health workers and other organizations who do the distribution and monitor the distribution for us in a variety of ways. So lots of organizations support us, and we're particularly proud of the fact that no organization that's ever supported us has ever stepped away 14 years on. And in part, that's because what we've asked for has been within reason. You know, we've not asked for something ridiculous that after a few years, somebody in the company says, hang on a minute, we're supporting this guy with 50 grand a year. I mean, shouldn't we change that now? It's very focused what we get from people. It's sort of in and out help that is incredibly valuable, but it means it's sustainable. So our guiding principles, as you would imagine, I think for every charity, the first word on the list should be impact. And for us, it's reducing illness and preventing deaths. But we're particularly keen on transparency, accountability, efficiency. And again, you can read faster than I can talk here. But all of those things are really important to us, particularly accountability. And that talks to this issue of saying to governments in Africa, we don't deal in trust, we deal in data. In terms of how accountability works for us, it's really twofold. If we hold our partners in country to account, then it will mean that nets get to the people who need them, and they won't get stolen and they won't get diverted. And that just drives, you know, our fundamental impact measures and what we're trying to achieve. And if we can say to our donors, this is where your money has funded nets, these are the number of nets you've bought, these are the number of people we estimate, number of nets times 1.8 that you will have protected. We share with our donors where they're having an impact rather than producing a glossy brochure at the end of the year. And we found that over the years, that's been really helpful in encouraging repeat donations. And we have, as somebody said to me recently at a conference with other charities, apparently AMF has an insane repeat donation rate. It's high anyway. We get a lot of people that decide or choose to continue to give to us, and obviously that's fundamental to us doing our work. Here's an example of what we do. So Ntcheu is one district in Malawi. We've got 28 districts, north of 500,000 people, and we distributed 270,000 nets to cover every sleeping space. Every single household was visited beforehand. So with roughly 5 people per household, that was roughly 110,000 households. We had all of the data from those households that was salient to working out how many nets they needed. It went into a database, it was interrogated, so that we knew that when we turned up underneath a shady tree or whatever the distribution point was with 1,300 nets for that particular set of 2 villages, we knew that household A would get 3 nets and household B would get 4 nets, and therefore it is equitable and it's fair and everybody gets covered. And that's very different, by the way, if you turn up and you don't have enough nets, because understandably people can be really quite upset. You can even get to the point where people are violent about not getting the number of nets they feel they need. And so all of this preparatory work, it's a bit like painting a room. 90% of the work is in the preparation, and then the last bit is wielding the paintbrush, or in this case, just handing out the nets. We make sure that when the nets are handed out, there's independent supervision. So you have health leaders on one side, you have village chiefs on another side. They're all very important people in the district. And we have one person that is an independent supervisor who is there to make sure that those people who turn up and identify themselves receive the right number of nets. And if they don't turn up, nets aren't handed out to somebody else, because that can happen. So we keep it neat and organized. And often the individual that you have as an independent supervisor is a teenage girl. I have 2 of them, and I know that they are not to be argued with. So it's just the fact you have somebody there who is designated that task of controlling, if you like, the release of the nets. So it's done in a managed fashion. We go back to survey households every 6 months. We believe that's important, both for understanding that the nets are there and being used and what the coverage levels are. So we have the data, and that can produce comforting results. It can produce surprising results. Sometimes you find that the hang-up level has fallen away. It might be because you're at an area with some degree of altitude, and they think that we don't need to use our nets. It's the low mosquito season. And so the information can be action-oriented, in that the district health officer can now say, of these 37 health center catchment areas I'm responsible for, I don't need to worry about 25 of them or 30 of them. I only need to go to these 7, because the data shows me that if we intervened with some malaria education or some other intervention, we can increase the hang-up level. And so post-distribution surveys can be really helpful for, again, fighting malaria and reducing it. We track all sorts of information. Malaria case rate data is included. I won't say too much about that. It's really noisy data, unfortunately. So what we focus on more than that is coverage levels, because we know if sleeping spaces are covered, malaria rates fall. And this is what happens in terms of that decline. And a 10% decline in a major health problem over a period of months would be a massive thing. And so you can see here that this is extraordinary. You can achieve such a reduction, 40 to 50% in a matter of weeks. And if the will, the money, the effort is there, it can be driven further down. And as I will mention at the end, eradication, elimination of malaria is possible. So major impact when we distribute nets. What we're doing as an organization at the moment is distributing millions of nets at a time as a result of the funds that have flowed to us. And that's been transformational for us, because we can go to a Ministry of Health and say, rather than saying, hi, I've got 300,000 nets to help you with your 10 million net gap, because there are these extraordinary gaps, I'm afraid. There's a lack of funding, people go unprotected. We can turn up and say, we've got 12 million nets to completely fill your gap. Now, what that means is that we have, metaphorically speaking, a bigger seat at the table. So when we're trying to achieve levels of accountability, data on households, all sorts of information around data, which some ministries of health will resist for a variety of reasons. They don't really want to do that work unless they have to. If we're turning up with millions of nets at a time, what we have managed to achieve over the last 2 or 3 years is I would almost say transformational changes in accountability in these countries. Ministries of health are now changing the way they're doing things. And I'll come on to one small example in a minute. And that, I think, is really good for the people in these countries and for malaria control. So we tend to fund about 30 to 60% of the nets a country needs. And that's probably about 35% of the total cost of a universal coverage campaign. Because remember, we only fund the nets, we don't fund the non-net costs. Other people fund those. So Papua New, you see the percentages, in fact, on this page. In Papua New Guinea, we're at a much higher level. So one of the things that we've done in Uganda, to give you an example of the way we approach accountability, is to say we might get data from households, but can we trust it? Is it reliable? Can we have confidence in it? And so one of the things that we instituted a number of years ago was to request, now it's in all of our agreements, that when data is collected, it is done using what we refer to as 105% data collection. So if I paint the picture of 100 data collectors being in a room about to go out and collect data from 100% of the households in a particular area, we in fact have 105 data collectors in a room. And what we say to all of the 105 is that you 100 would do the first 100% gathering, and these 5 people will go to 5% of the households that each of you visit without any knowledge of the data you collected, and then we will compare the 5% that overlap. And in some cases, the first set of data collectors don't get paid until that 5% overlap is checked. And what that does is it provides, if you like, a psychological mechanism that costs very little money to make sure that the data collected is really accurate, and we have statistically significant information that gives us confidence that the data collected is good. Because what we don't want is people putting down a household needs 4 nets when they actually need 3, because that's a 33% inflation rate. 5 against 4 nets is a 25%. You can see how, if that was done systemically or systematically, you'd have millions more nets being required than you need. And we believe in the past that that's been a major problem in net campaigns. And so bringing together this sort of very focused approach on data is saving money and improving the way things work. Perhaps I'll come back to these new PBO nets, but in the interest of time, I'll simply say that mosquitoes develop resistance to the insecticide on the nets. Darwin told us that will happen. It's happening. Where it will go, scale-wise, we don't know, but there is a new type of net that we're trialing that seems to have a much greater impact on those mosquitoes, the small percentage that have developed a resistance to the insecticide. So it could be a really big part of the future. And we've personally, as an organization, put about $9 million into that, and the malaria world is waiting with great interest as to the results of that survey, which we'll know in about a year's time. That trial, I should say. So our growth as an organization has been a slightly hockey stick, I suppose. 7 or 8 years of hard work. Not that it's not hard work now, but you'll see that the 2 types of donors we have are those individual donors, or what I often call majority donors, people like us, who give €2 or 10 Swiss francs or $5 or £3, and that's the area of the graph coloured in red. And you can see that that's really our platform. It's our lifeblood. It's what allows us to be here. And every donation matters, because every net matters, because everyone protects 2 people. And you can see the sort of relatively small numbers, $200, $500, $3,000 as to what these numbers can achieve. You will appreciate, I'm sure, that when we have some extraordinarily large donations, hundreds of thousands, and is to me is a extraordinary donation, millions of dollars is stratospheric. But what it's allowed us to do is to get into these millions of nets circumstance, so that we are having a much better outcome now in terms of driving through accountability. So some of these large donations have been really transformational. So 2 really critical types of donors. And the revenues as a result have skipped up. I think they went 124. You can imagine I was hoping for 8, but it went to 5. No, it went 1248 and then 5, not 16, then up to 14 in the last couple of years, $50 million. I think we'll probably be a little bit lower this year, because we had some very sizable donations in the last 2 years, and they've been lower this year. But the $160 million we've raised over the last 12 years, you'll see that the dominant part of that is in the last few years, has meant that if we were to wrap statistics around this, it's something of the order of 100,000 deaths averted, 100 million cases of malaria averted, and that means that we're protecting something like towards 130 million people. So it's a decent contribution. And I think in 2017, the 4 biggest funders of nets were the Global Fund. Some of you may be aware of the Global Fund, funded by our governments, in essence, the US government, the British government, and then AMF. And seeing as I run this out of the back room of my house in London, in one sense, it's pretty shocking, but we're doing what we can. We are very happy to be held accountable by all sorts of people, and the effective altruism movement has been almost existential for us. I mean, it's certainly been, it's allowed us to do what we do. So we are extremely not only grateful for what some of these organizations have said about us when they've probed and probed us and asked us lots of questions, but I guess you wouldn't be surprised to hear from me that I'm a particular fan of the EA movement, because I think that it has the opportunity to create, to affect unbelievable change. I think in some ways, we've just scratched the surface now. And whatever anybody might say of AMF, my view of EA and that whole movement doesn't change. As we just go through the last few slides, just gives you an idea of some of the things we do with data. Some of you may be familiar with this. We list every donation on our website so that we can actually say to donors, you bought this many nets and they've protected or will protect this many people, and this is where they're being distributed. And that's part of my particular and personal approach to transparency. I guess I'm probably one of the greatest cynics in the world when it comes to charity, I'm afraid. And if I thought I was cynical about international aid when I started AMF, boy, am I cynical now, given what I've seen over the last 12 years. So it drives us towards doing things in a particular way. Donors also have a personal page where they can track their donations and see what's happened, because we think that donors may want to know that, and we certainly want to show them where they're having impact. We, as I mentioned, take all the data from a particular distribution area, and I think this is the top of a 4 million household record that we have in one of our databases, all very securely held because it's in a sense sovereign data from a country, so we treat it with particular attention. But it allows us to really conduct a very accurate distribution. So we have lots of data from lots of countries that we use. As I mentioned, we go and we check on the nets after we've distributed them every 6 months or so. And here's an example of where in one district in Malawi, Ntcheu, that I mentioned earlier, the information we were feeding through to the district health officer was that these really are the few health centre catchment areas you need to focus on, and you can take action with this data if you wish. We can't force people to do that, but we obviously make all the survey data, the check data that we collect, we make it available to our partners. This is the most exciting slide if you're an accountant, but it's not likely to be the most exciting slide for you. But I mention it because we're really big on reducing admin and the time it takes us to do things. So all of our numbers we curate, if you like, in sort of real time, and we publish our accounts to date live on the website, which has all sorts of benefits for us, and it's of interest, we understand, for a number of our donors. But it means that when we file our financial accounts at the end of the year, what used to take 3 people about 6 weeks at PricewaterhouseCoopers now means that we can hand off to our auditor 9 hours after the end of our financial year all of the material they need to audit us. And it's 9 hours because I'm asleep for 7 of them. So I write a commentary or finalize a commentary, and then we send out our documentation. So it's one of the ways, and is a good example of many of the things we do within AMF are sort of really squashed down to 5-minute or 1-minute tasks, as opposed to something that in many organizations takes days or weeks to do. But I do understand, and you'll forgive me if this is not the most exciting slide in the deck. We're looking now at a whole series of countries. We have now moved into a situation where we're funding millions of nets at a time, and we look at 3 years because that is a really good time to get proper planning in place. You don't really want to be in a position to fund nets in 4 or 6 months' time, because operations and planning is critical to a really good campaign. And we have some difficult decisions to make shortly, because I'm allocating about $50 million at the moment, and I've got north now of $200 million worth of requests. So we're going to have to make some really difficult decisions whereby there will be people in countries in the millions who simply go to sleep at night with malaria carrying mosquitoes buzzing around, and they will have no protection because there isn't enough money. And so, we don't have any additional motivation required to keep going. We haven't listed the countries by name for obvious reasons, but big gaps. Technology is a big part of the way we're headed in the field, as well as what we do sort of back at HQ, if you like. And smartphones are potentially a really important part of making what we do happen better. You'll see the advantages of using smartphones and collecting data at household level across hundreds of thousands and millions of households using electronic devices. But remember that sometimes that's got to be very carefully thought through, because when you deploy technology, you've got to pilot it, you've got to see what all the mistakes are, learn the lessons. You can't just go into a country and across 20 million people and 5 million households collect data using smartphones. But when you do, you get things like this. So this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, I think it may be second bottom in terms of GDP per capita and so on. But this shows within 6 meters the location of more or less 250,000 households that receive nets. And is a very efficient way of managing data, and also providing us additional accountability. So even in one of the poorest countries in the world with incredibly difficult infrastructure and so on, we can bring technology to bear. And so there are many opportunities for us on the operations side. Last slide gives, I guess, an optimistic view of, we've done a lot in 15 years, and we've been going for about that period of time, a little under. And malaria cases have come down by 60%, malaria deaths have come down by 60%, and an awful lot of malaria cases prevented. These are really conservative numbers, by the way, because they're put together by the WHO, and they have to be necessarily conservative. And a huge portion of that impact has been contributed by bed nets. And we're now at the stage where I mentioned earlier, eliminating and eradicating malaria. Countries are being declared malaria-free. So I guess the final very optimistic thing I would say is in Sri Lanka, which had 3 years of no native cases of malaria, and therefore were declared malaria-free, is now a country that does not have malaria. And before, it had a lot of it, and it was a real problem. So this is not an intractable disease that can't be fixed. It can be. And whilst there's no vaccine, whilst gene drive technology is still in its infancy, although fingers crossed one of those comes through, as one of my colleagues said, in the malaria area, we know what to do, we know how to prevent it, we know how to treat it, we just need to get on with it. And so that's what we're going to keep doing.
Wow, thank you, Rob.
Thank you for listening.
We now have about 10 minutes for questions. You know where the mic is. Speak clearly in the mic. Make sure Rob can hear you.
You've chosen to keep your staff very lean with just 4 or 5 people. Why is it that you've made that decision?
We hire somebody when we think we need them. And so Andrew and I, who was my head of technology in a previous life, ran AMF for 10 years. And what we found is that we could structure things on the fundraising side whereby we leverage technology. We obviously put a lot of work into World Swim, and that was, again, just 2 of us. I guess I had a lot of meetings with people, and I ended up being quite persuasive. And so we managed to get World Swim to happen, and then people heard about us. And I guess, as my grandfather said, don't market yourself, just get on with the job. And if you do it right, people will hear about it, people talk about it, and maybe that'll drive you forward. And I guess because of the technology we have behind the sort of admin side of things, that's really slick. And so 2 of us could handle that for 10 years. We just didn't need anybody else. I didn't have a PA, or I don't have a PA. We didn't need staff. And from the distributing nets side, strategically, there was no need to build an organization to distribute nets. you need 7,000 people in Uganda to distribute nets. It was always going to be, it always has been, always will be, the national health system with other partners brought in to monitor and check up on things and report to us. And so as I went through, strategically and operationally, what do I need to do the job? I just didn't need to hire anybody. And then it got to the stage where, and I think also there's a feeling about growth in that, whilst there are organizations that go from 1 to 100 to 10,000 to 1 million very quickly, our growth is, I think we learned a lot in those 5 or 6 years that meant that when we started to sort of up the gear and the money came in, and I had conversations with people who'd say, Rob, if I gave you $1 million, can you handle it? And I go, absolutely. And I was completely confident that I could deliver. Because one of the things that I guess sits with me personally is I always want to do what I say I will do, and I never want to let anybody down. And so I will make sure that we have in place a mechanism where we don't fail in any big way. We make mistakes all the time. I should have hired an operations manager 2 years ago, and I'm kicking myself for not doing so, which in a sense talks to your question of we perhaps should have taken on a few people earlier. But strategically, in the way we're set up and the partnerships we have, I just don't need many people. And I could spend another $150 million tomorrow. And that would take our revenues for this year to close to $200 million, or certainly north of 178, 180 million. And I don't need to take on any more staff, maybe one more. So we're highly scalable in what we do because we use agreements, mechanisms, partnership organizations. We structure things differently. And perhaps I'd say, I know this is not a particularly short answer, but remember there are lots of people around us that do certain things that in many organizations might be paid for, or they might have staff. So, all of the translating we do is done for free. All of the auditing is done for free. There are many things that we don't have to have in-house because there are other people that will assist us. And I would estimate that's probably at least another 2 or 3 or 4 people, but hey, we still wouldn't be a very big organization. Great question, thank you.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I know from the donor side, we really appreciate the accountability that you offer us. It's very nice to receive a thank you email saying exactly how many nets were funded and where they went. I wanted to ask sort of a tangential question about the end of life process for these nets that you're distributing. So after 3 years, yeah. Can you shed any light on how the nets are disposed of and what's the environmental impact of discarding millions of insecticide-treated nets?
Yeah. Let me do it bullet point fashion because this is such a big topic and I don't want to leave it at sort of 30 seconds with so many questions unanswered. But what it boils down to is we don't just get rid of the nets because ethically, morally, we can't. When they're distributed to a household, those households own the net. It's just not feasible or ethical to go back to the households and take them away. And I say taking away because they have a secondary life. They have a secondary life covering crops, chicken coops. We've all heard the stories about nets being used for fishing. Some are, but not many. The scale is small. And so when that's reported, I'm not diminishing the problem of nets being used for fishing in particular locations, but we have to keep this in perspective. There are 200 million nets or 150 million nets distributed each year, and some thousands of them might be used for fishing. Bad, needs to be fixed. But at the end of the day, our primary issue is stopping people falling sick and dying from malaria. And that means we need a net because it's the best mechanism we have. The plastic in the nets, if we were all to put our heads together and say, come on, let's get a recycling thing going and take them out of the system because they're not only plastic, but they're also got insecticide on them, so we don't want them lying around. And let's say we could move beyond not being able to take them from households. The plastic volume that are nets is a fraction of a percentage of the plastics in Africa. So really it's a sort of, the problem with plastic and recycling is a much bigger issue. It's not just nets. And the problem you would have is that these plastics have insecticide on them. So the negative end of life element, and I think there is a negative end of life element to a degree. There's also a positive end of life element in that these nets have this secondary use and they are valued, is one that is simply dwarfed by if I were to invite all of you to come to a village in the middle of Malawi with me that had malaria, unquestionably, every single one of us would want to sleep under a net. So it's an issue of, I guess, of priority. Unfortunately, we're not in the business of solving that end of life bit. We can't.
Hi, thanks a lot for talking with us. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the AMF Foundation or AMF's internal decision-making process for deciding where to deploy the nets, both in terms of what country and then which regions you go to.
Sure. So we will liaise with the Global Fund, we will liaise with other partners, we will liaise with the Ministry of Health, and we will want to understand what's the population, how many nets do you need, which other funders are there, what are they funding, and ultimately, what is the net gap? Is there a net gap? And if there is, what is the net gap in terms of dollars? And that typically is dollars for nets plus non-net costs. So country A, I won't mention them, but we're being approached at the moment for 5.5 million nets because there is an $11 million gap. That $11 million is roughly 3.5 million nets, but we would only fund the nets, not the non-net cost. So if we funded 5.5 million nets, it would free up some money that would be used for non-net costs, and together with our funding partners, we would solve the problem. We will look at malaria case rate data. We will understand whether it's a high, medium, or low malaria burden area. Most of the areas we deal with, I'm afraid, countries we deal with are high malaria burden or medium malaria burden, certainly well above the threshold you'd want to distribute nets. We look at urban areas, and sometimes we will come forward and we will not make ourselves popular, but we will say, given there is a 2% parasite level in the population in the city, and in the rural areas of this and other countries, it's 40, 50, 60, 70%. We just simply cannot justify allocating $3 million to nets to cover those 3 urban areas, because we're not going to be able to fund nets in this other country. And therefore we need to come to an agreement that we're funding a real gap as opposed to everybody in a country. So it's a combination of understanding where there are gaps, who else has got money, is there a real gap there that we're going to be funding? We also look carefully at the attitude of the Ministry of Health and the National Malaria Control Program. And to use 2 extreme examples, or to use an extreme example, we don't turn up, by the way, and we don't say, look, this is the deal, here's our agreement, sign it, or we're out of here. What we say is, this is our draft agreement. We understand every country is different, but data and accountability is incredibly important to us. So if there are issues you have with the 33 clauses in our agreement, it's only 4 pages, 5 pages, not very long. Let's talk about it and see whether we can come up with another way of being accountable. And if we found, as we have on 2 occasions, that we've just not been able to make progress with governments, they have refused to release household data to us, they've refused to do certain things, it puts me in a sad position in that I can't progress with something in that country. But the hard decision we have to make is that I only have $50 million and I'm being asked for 200 million. I'm afraid there are plenty of countries that I can go to, and we have to withdraw and say that it doesn't work for us to support you. Now, the cynic in me would say that one of the reasons for that, and unfortunately, if we had more time, and perhaps I wasn't being recorded, I would be able to tell you stories that would make your hair stand on end in terms of what we have experienced in Africa. 98% of the people we come across are unbelievably terrific, full of integrity, hardworking. But it doesn't take many in any society, our own, to divert things. And my belief is that typically it's a very small number of people that do not have the interests of their fellow citizens, their fellow nationals at heart. And that makes me both really angry and it makes me really upset that we now can't provide, as in one case, we couldn't provide 3.9 million nets because I was convinced that the people at the top were involved in corrupt and fraudulent activity. But there's nothing I could do about it. They refused to agree to basic accountability elements, so we had to move on.
I think I have time for one more question.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for your time. I have a slightly more personal question. So I know you spent 20 years in the private sector before you started doing this. When would you say is the right time to have left the private sector? At what point did the skills that you gain like stop being really useful? Like, is it 5 years, is it 10 years? Is it 15 or 20 years? Thank you.
If I had to give you one answer, and you'll know the restrictions on one answer to a question like that, I mean, it's a great question, one that's very personal to all of us. I probably would say 15 years. On the basis that in my particular case, I felt as though, I mean, my career was chemical engineering at university. I then went to become a strategy consultant with a big American firm, took myself to Italy because I wanted to learn a language. 4 years there, went to business school for 2 years, came back to the UK, commercial director of an entrepreneurial exhibitions business, a trade shows business, and then was hoiked into a large financial publishing company where I was operations director of a 1,500 person organization with global reach, and then ultimately managing director of one of our divisions. And so my career has been, not very good at anything. I'm not being falsely modest, but I'm not perfect at anything, but I've sort of got up to a level and a threshold with lots of things where I think I knew how to sell, I knew how to manage, I knew how to get things done, I knew how to be commercial, I knew how to focus on operations, I knew how to be a bit strategic. And I guess each of us takes a different path, but I think that it probably takes 10 to 15 years to build up some of that experience. Certainly if I look at myself, and I may have been a slow learner, it might take others 5 to 10 years. I think that when you come out of, college or university and you think, you go through your 20s into your early 30s, I think you start gaining significant responsibility in your late 20s and early 30s potentially. So for me, that was right. But to steal Dustin Moscovitz's words, Dustin was one of the founders of Facebook, as some of you may know, was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate at Harvard when they set up Facebook. Dustin answers the question, why should you set up an organization? And I realize your question isn't necessarily setting up an organization, but he says it's not for money, it's not for power, it's not for glory, it's not for anything else because you work late and the buck stops with you and all the rest of it. His comment is you do it because you can't not do it. And I guess that talks to the issue of passion and so on. I felt that there was a confluence for me in my life, I built up enough skills where I felt confident enough that I could sort of cover a whole bunch of stuff and get things done, which ultimately is the bottom line. You've got to get things done. And persuade people to support you, I guess, and surround yourself with good people. And I felt really passionate about something. My wife and I had 2 young children. I saw Terry, who was a child who suffered 90% burns in a house fire. I was really moved by 1 hour of television on her. I was streaming as I was watching it, I'm not ashamed to say. And I had 2 young children at the time. And then when I scratched the surface and thought, I wonder if I could leverage this 10,000 people swimming in, 75 countries for a burns victim who lives 40 miles north of London into something else for something that's, and wow, this malaria thing. I mean, this is ridiculous. I guess I got the passion that I really wanted to put my time into something in that area. And now we have 4 children. And as I've said to people, my 4 kids go to sleep at night. And if they get bitten by a mosquito, it's an annoying itch. Whereas the people we're trying to help and assist, if their children or their family members get bitten at night, then it's severe illness or worse. And so I feel really lucky that I'm in a position to try and direct my time in that area. There will be others who are far younger than I was in my late 30s, I guess, who will feel passionate about something and will go into something entrepreneurial or charity based, and that will be right for them because they have the passion to drive forward and they'll pick up skills along the way. So, I think there are. It depends on you. What I would say is if you can bring to bear a certain passion and commitment, and you really answer Dustin's question of can you really not do it, and if that is I just can't not do it, I've got to do it, then the time is right.
All right, thank you so much, Rob.